All right, I'm going to get started. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening. Welcome to the first spring 2021 Ronald and Janette Gatty lecture of the series for the spring semester. My name is Cara, and I'm one of the Southeast Asian graduate co-chairs. I am a Master's of Public Administration candidate, and I'm focusing on infrastructure and technology policy, specifically how we can do so that also helps our environment. And my area of focus is Cambodia. I am also joined here by my lovely co-chair, Anna, and also one of our wonderful administrative assistants, James. If you have any issues, feel free to message us, but if it's a Zoom-related problem, do James, because unfortunately I'm still figuring out how to work it, even though I've been doing this for an entire semester. So I'm going to give a brief introduction of the Gatty Lecture Series, since it's the first one of the spring semester. We have these nearly every week on Thursdays, usually 12:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. This week, obviously, as you can see, we're having an 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in order so that we can have wonderful Joe join us here today. And he's calling all the way from Thailand. Thank you so much for sacrificing your morning for us. And to give a brief overview, the Gatty Lectures are a weekly series meant to unite advanced CEEP graduate students, as well as academics, diplomats, researchers, and others who have expertise in Southeast Asia. I can provide the link that shows all lectures we have lined up for the semester. I hope you all join for more than just this one, because we have an absolutely wonderful lineup, and I'm really excited for this semester, as I'm sure the rest of you are, of course. Oh, I don't have a link. Well, I'll put the link later. But the lectures are about 45 minutes with an approximate 20-minute Q&A period. I'm going to invite you, you can put the Q&A, your questions in the chat as the lecture is going on if a question pops up in your head, but you're not going to be able to unmute yourself during the lecture, because we want the lecture to go uninterrupted and Joe to impart all of his wonderful wisdom with us uninterrupted. So during the question period, we're going to ask you to put, again, your question in the chat box. And the reason we do that is so we can go through all of the questions in order and make sure we get to the questions in order and get to as many as possible. And then we're also going to invite you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question live. This hopefully makes it more interactive. And I understand there's probably some non-native English speakers here, and maybe you're not comfortable typing out your question. Totally understand. Again, I still ask you to put your question in the chat so we can have the whole lineup, but hopefully you can ask your question live and we can hear your wonderful voice and not just mine going on and on and on. And now I'm about to take it to Joe. I'm going to give a very non-rehearsed, non-written out introduction that I'm not going to read at the side of my computer. So Joe Pittayaporn, is joining us from Thailand, and his lecture is titled Old Tai and the Arrival of Tai in Central Thailand. He is an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics and the head of Southeast Asian Linguistic Research Unit, Faculty of Arts in Chulalongkorn University. He specialized in historical linguistics and phonology, and his research focuses on tone and prosody in mainland Southeast Asia and the history of Kradai languages, including Thai. He received his PhD in linguistics from the most wonderful university in the world, Cornell, in 2009 with a dissertation titled Phonology of Proto-Tai. So Joe, would you like to take it away from me, please?
Yes, thank you, Cara, for the introduction, and thank you, the CEEP Graduate Student Committee, for inviting me to give a talk here. It's very emotional for me to be here this morning, because it's like coming back home, and it's been 12 years, I think, since the last time I gave well, it was called the Brow Back lecture back then. So so back in the spring of 2009, while I was frantically writing my dissertation, I had the honor to give a talk in this very forum, the weekly Brow Back lectures, which happen every Thursday with pizzas. I don't know if you guys still have pizzas for lunch. I guess not, because of COVID, but it was a wonderful experience for me, being part of Cornell and giving a lecture to my it was a good experience being at Cornell and to give a talk at the Thursday Brow Bag, because it helped me. It forced me to learn how to talk to non-linguists about the kind of research that I do. So that was part of my wonderful training that I had at Cornell, and I'm still very grateful for what I have learned at Cornell and from C back then. So in that presentation in 2009, I talked about when and where Southwestern Tai started to mutate into different dialects before bursting out to occupy most of mainland Southeast Asia. So after exactly 12 years, I'm here again to share with you what I have learned since. As the title, Old Tai and the Arrival of Central Tai suggests, today I will be focusing on the prehistory of the language we know today as Tai or Central Tai or Siamese. It is a synthesis of different projects that I have done alone or in collaboration with my graduate students and my colleagues from other disciplines. Like I work with geneticists on different projects on the genetic history of people in central Thailand, and I'll be talking about that a little bit at the end of this talk. So let's start with the let me share my screen. Okay. To give you more context, let's first look at the linguistic landscape of mainland Southeast Asia. Currently, there are 5 language families in this very wonderfully linguistically diverse region. So these 5 language families are represented by different colors on this map. I'll be talking about 2 families in particular. The first one is the Austroasiatic family, represented in red on the map. Before the spread of other families into the area, the Southeast Asian peninsula was occupied mostly by Austroasiatic speaking people. So the whole peninsula was probably red. You can see now that these the red. You can see now that Austroasiatic languages do not form a contiguous, patch, but smaller patches disconnected by the green and the purple. And that's because about 1,000 years ago, Thai languages started coming into the area and pushed the Austroasiatic languages onto the fringes. Well, except for Vietnamese, which also push away their own its own relative, but is another big topic. So an example of Austroasiatic languages include Khmer and Mon and Vietnamese, and a lot of other smaller languages like the ASEAN languages in Malaysia, the Palong, the Wa, etc. The second family I'll be talking about is the Thai language, the Thai languages. The Thai languages is actually a branch of the Kra-Dai language family. The Kra-Dai language family originates in southern China, but they started coming into Southeast Asia possibly around the 10th or 11th century. My previous research has suggested that they started spreading from southern China after the Tang Dynasty, so approximately the 11th century. But today we are not going to talk about Tai languages as a whole, but I'll be talking about one particular language, which is the Tai language. We also call it Central Tai or Siamese. It's the official language of Thailand, spoken in the Chao Phraya River Basin, so around here. Well, Tai is a politically charged term. I'm not going to get into the details, but basically I'm not talking about Northern Tai or Isan or Laos or Southern Tai for that matter. I'm focusing on the language spoken in the central part of Thailand here. Do you see a cursor?
No, we do not see a cursor, unfortunately. Maybe if you know how to turn on laser pointer, that could help.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. Yeah, so we are just gonna talk about the Tai language as is spoken in Central Thailand, which is now the official language of the country. The Tai language is a member of the Southwestern group of Tai languages. The Southwestern group is the most widespread and most numerous branch of the Tai family. You can see the purple on this map. That's the extent of the Tai languages, of the Southwestern group of Tai languages. So the Southwestern, this group includes, Shan, Laos, Lu, Black Tai, Red Tai, etc. So most Tai languages in mainland Southeast Asia belongs to this Southwestern branch. You can see that there's not really much diversity here in mainland Southeast Asia because that's the homeland of the Tai language, the origin of the Tai languages is in southern China. So you see a lot of diversity in southern China rather than in mainland Southeast Asia. What you see in mainland Southeast Asia is just one fraction of the diversity of Tai and Kra-Dai languages. So this is the family tree for the Kra-Dai language family. You can see down here. Let me try to use the laser pointer. So down at the bottom of the tree, you see the Tai family, and you have the southwestern branch, the central branch, and the northern branch. Okay? That's just to give you an idea of what we are talking about. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Tai homeland is not in mainland Southeast Asia. Among linguists, the consensus view places the origin of Tai languages in southern Guangxi. The homeland is thought to be where the highest linguistic diversity is represented, and that's in the western part of the Yong River with the center in Chongzuo. Here's the map that I made out of a Google map. So Chongzuo in red is where I think the homeland of the Tai language is. sometimes in the late, in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, the Tai languages started to spread northwesternward. And then at the beginning of the second millennia, Southwestern Tai languages started to spread down to mainland Southeast Asia. You can see three arrows here. They're not actually representing three roots, but just to show that they move in not in one directions, but they make different routes into mainland Southeast Asia. But like I said before the arrival of the Thai, central Thailand wasn't Thai speaking. In the second half of the first millennium, central Thailand was dominated by Mon speakers, as attested by the Varavati inscriptions from the 6th to the 9th centuries. However, the situation changed at the turn of the millennium, as the Khmer had come to succeed the Mon in central Thailand. Difflot proposes that the Nyakur speaking people who now lives in the highlands on the fringe of central Thailand, on the fringe of the central plain, are remnants of the Mon speakers that still survive today. But anyway, in the 10th to 11th century, the Khmer came to dominate the area. You can see that you no longer see Mon inscriptions anymore. You see lots of Khmer inscriptions starting from the 10th century. So various people have proposed that the expansion of Thai people into Southeast Asia proper happened in the 10th to 12th century, but it's really not clear when exactly and how that happened. So this is a map of what the Thai language, this is the map of mainland Southeast Asia during the 12th century, which is the time that we'll be talking about. You can see the Khmer Empire, in pink. That's the extent of the kingdom. So when speakers of Thai languages arrived in the area, they surely met with the Khmer language. Despite scholars believe that Thai people, well, we have to distinguish between people and its the language and its speakers, because they might not be the same thing. So despite the general belief that the Thai people arrived in Thailand or in Southeast Asia in the 12th century, 11th century, we really don't have any evidence. We don't have any text that goes back that long. The earliest inscriptions for any Thai languages only goes back to the 14th century. So the Bang Snook inscription, which is the oldest uncontroversial inscription in Thai, THAI, is dated to 1339, the early 14th century. And we don't see anything older than that anywhere in in Southeast Asia. So Tai languages, we don't have attestations of Tai languages anywhere before the 14th century. Okay, so our topic today will be on Old Tai. By Old Tai, I mean the Tai language spoken in central Thailand during the 14th to the mid 17th century. We can talk about why I limited to the 15th century, to the mid 15th century, but that's another research topic. We can talk about that in the Q&A question. Old Tai is attested in Sukhothai and Ayutthaya inscriptions, as well as poetic works attributed to the 14th and 15th century. And also, it's also attested in transcriptions of Thai proper names in Ming records. The earliest attestation of the Thai Thai, that's the language we are talking today. The earliest inscription of Thai is found. So the earliest Thai inscriptions are found in both the upper and lower Chao Phraya river basin. They're dated from the early 14th century to the 15th century. They're either made of sandstone, slate, tin, copper, gold, or silver. Even though it's Thai language, it's actually written in two different scripts. You can write the old Thai language in the Thai script or in a Khmer script. They write the same language, but using different scripts. And these inscriptions are either oaths, dedications, donations, wishes, creations of religious objects, and descriptions of political events. So this is a picture of the Bang Snook inscription, which is supposed to be the oldest Thai inscription. Well, putting aside the controversial Ramkhamhaeng inscription. This is the Bang Snook inscription is found in the upper Chao Phraya River, which was part of the Sukhothai kingdom. But this tin inscription is from Wat Mahathat in Ayutthaya. So it's found in the lower part of the Chao Phraya River basin. So I mentioned earlier that at this period, there were two medieval kingdoms in central Thailand, Ayutthaya and Sukhothai. So the puzzle is when the Thai languages arrived in central Thailand, we have a rough idea that the Thai languages, the whole Southwestern Tai branch arrived in mainland Southeast Asia, sometimes vaguely, sometimes in the 10th or 11th century. But when did it arrive? When did the Thai language arrive in central Thailand? Since we don't have any textual evidence for it. And we also want to ask how that happened. Some people believe it's a case of Demic diffusion, which means that people came in with their language, so there was real migration. But some people actually believe that it's a case of cultural diffusion, so there wasn't really a real migration, but indigenous people just decided to adopt a new language because of cultural influence from people somewhere else. So we don't know if, basically I'm asking whether there was a real migration or not, or the language came down because of cultural diffusion. So I'll be talking about when and how the Thai came to dominate, the Thai language came to dominate the linguistic landscape of central Thailand. My proposal is that the Tai language arrived in central Thailand from the north in the 13th century. The appearance of Tai was due to a real migration of Tai-speaking communities into the region. Okay. So let's first look at the date of arrival, when the Tai arrived in central Thailand, and we can approach this problem by examining the old Tai language in the inscriptions, whether there are any clues. So even though it's the inscriptions are from the 14th, 15th century, but do we see any hints in the inscriptions that that the language was spoken in the area before the 14th century? But let's first understand how the Tai writing system came about. So again, when we talk about writing systems, we're not talking about the language, but the fact that it's being written down implies that it's already there, it's already present in the area. So the Tai writing system belongs to the Indic family of writing system. It was actually an adaptation of the Old Khmer script from the Angkorian period. Even though in the nationalistic discourse is claimed to be an invention of King Ram Kamhang, based on the controversial inscription of the 1292, there's really, we really don't know when the Tai script was, invented, so to speak. When the Tai script, when the Old Khmer script was first adapted to write Tai. So this is what the alphabet looks like. You know, if you know Tai or Lao, you can recognize a lot of these symbols. Okay, so, but how do we know? So we have the script, we see the inscriptions, but how do we know what the symbols represented, what sound the symbol represented? So as a linguist, as a historical linguist, what I do is I compare the symbols that is used in this inscription with the reconstruction of Proto-Southwestern Tai, which is the ancestor of the Tai language, and see how the symbols correspond to the sounds of Proto-Southwestern Tai. For example, the symbol S, the symbol that I romanize as S here, you see it in words like 10 and 2 and to send. And all these words had the S sound in Proto-Southwestern Tai. So we can be pretty sure that in Old Thai, it was pronounced as S, like an English S. So by doing this for each symbols in the Old Thai writing system, we can come up with the sound systems of Old Thai, which if you have here in this table, for non-linguists, you don't need to worry about the labels of the tables, you know, labials, alveolar, palatal, or stops and fricatives. These are linguistic terms that are used to describe these sounds. What's crucial here is that there were so many sounds in Old Thai that the Old Khmer script couldn't represent. So there weren't that many symbols in the Old Khmer script. So to use the Old Khmer script to write Old Tai, you would need to make modifications. And let me pronounce some of these sounds just to give you an idea what it sounded like. So Khmer didn't have f or v, or the X represents the sound h, and the symbol below the X represents the sound. You also have sounds like m, n, 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 l, hua, y. These are sounds that don't exist in modern Thai, but we can, applying our methodology, we know that it exists. It was there in Old Thai of the inscription. So to write all these sounds that the Khmer script didn't have symbols for, they had to invent new symbols. They had to add new symbols to the script. For example, the sound k, which sounded like k, sounded similar to k. So when they started writing the Old Thai, when they started adapting the Old Khmer system, they take the Khmer symbol for k, the kh symbol, and indented it, make an indentation onto the symbol. So you get a new unmodified kh symbol, and they represented different sounds. Similarly, the Khmer system had an M, something that we can Romanize as an M, representing the M sound. But Old Thai also had another sound, a very similar sound, but pronounced with aspiration in front of it. So instead of, in addition to M, Old Thai also have M, M. So the first people to write the Old Thai language had to combine the H symbol and the M symbol in Old Khmer to represent that sound that the Khmer script couldn't accommodate. So how do we know? So when we want to look for traces of when we want to see whether the Thai scripts of the 14th century, whether there had been a tradition of writing Thai before the 14th century, which is when we first find the inscriptions, right? We want to see whether there are signs of mismatches between sounds and symbols in the writing system. So if there are unnecessary symbols, so symbols that were invented to represent one sound but is no longer necessary, which has become redundant in the inscriptions, that would suggest that Thai was written even before the inscriptions were made. So this is just something that kind of funny, I think. So there's a epic spelling fail here. So can't wait for, so the confusion between colon and cologne is due, basically it's due to the graphic variation between N and GN in English. So these two spellings represent the same sound in modern day English. So people who some people may misspell words that has the N sound they can write it with an N or GN and it would sound the same, right? So, so when you see confusion between two symbols, that suggests that the two symbols were probably pronounced exactly the same. Well, this is a simplification just to give you an idea. So when we look at Sukhothai and Ayutthaya inscriptions, we see exactly this same kind of variation. We see variation between the simple KH symbol and the modified KH symbol for Old Thai, to represent Old Thai K and H sound. We also see the graphic variation between the Y symbol and the Ny the Enye symbol for Old Thai Y and Ny. And we also see variation between the I symbol and the modified I symbol for Old Thai I and Al. We'll see each of these now. So the first variation is between the simple KH symbol and the modified KH symbol. The simple KH symbol used to, in Old Thai, it represent KH, but the modified sorry, this is a typo. It should be a KH symbol with an apostrophe. So the modified KH symbol in the bottom was invented to represent the H sound, which Khmer didn't have. So originally we had two symbols that represented two different sounds. But when we look at Thai inscriptions from the 14th century, we see that the simple and the modified KH symbols can be used interchangeably to write both words that used to have K and H. So the word that used to, that's supposed to be spelled with the simplified KH symbol, started to be spelled with the simple KH symbol in the mid-14th century, as attested in the J.D. Pihan inscription, the Nakhon Chum inscription. This kind of variation suggests that early Old Thai H, the X sound, and had merged with the K sound before the 14th century. And this is my data. So the word for rice used to be pronounced khao, and it's supposed to have to be represented with a modified KH symbol, but you see in a lot of cases it's spelled with the simple KH symbol, which suggests that K and K had merged. So this is also the case with rice to ascend, torn, and white. The next, so what we see here is that in early Old Thai, that is when the Khmer writing system was first adopted to write Thai. It was first adapted to write Thai. You had two symbols representing two different sounds. But in later Old Thai, in the 14th century, you have a merger between the two sounds. So the two symbols could be used interchangeably. The next graphic variation that we'll look at today is the variation between the Y symbol and the Enye symbol. Originally, they represented two different sounds. the Y symbol represented the Y sound, and the Enya symbol represented the Nya sound, a similar sound but pronounced with the the air stream coming out of your nose, the air stream coming through your nose. It's kind of like the Enya in Spanish. You can see that they use totally different symbols for these two sounds, because in Khmer and in Indic languages, you have a clear contrast between these two sounds. So they had two different sounds, two different symbols for the two sounds. The old Thai script also had a clear contrast between the two symbols, between the Y symbol and the Enya symbol, and they use them to represent the Y and the Nya sound in Old Thai. However, in the mid-14th century, Nya started to be spelled with words that should be spelled with the Enya symbol started to be spelled with the Y symbol in the mid-14th century, as attested in Phopun Rampon inscription and in the inscription of Wat Mahathai. The first one is from Sukhothai and the second one is from Ayutthaya. So we see the same kind of graphic variation again, which suggests that early old Thai Nya sound had merged with early old Thai Y sound. So here you can see that the words for grandmother and difficult had Y in Old Thai, and it's never written with a Nya. But the word to and highest point, which was pronounced with Nya as initial consonant in Old Thai, can be written either way in the inscription. So it can be written with the Y symbol or the Enya symbol. This suggests that the two sounds had merged by the time of the inscriptions. This is another graphic variation. The I symbol originally was used to write the I sound, but you also have the modified I symbol, which represented au, something that we don't have in modern Thai. Au. But we started to see that the two symbols were used interchangeably again in the 14th century, attested even in the Bamsanuk inscription, which is supposed to be the oldest inscription. Also in Ayutthaya, so attested in an inscription behind a Buddha statue in the National Museum in Jangasem Palace. So this graphic variation suggests that early Old Thai Al and I had merged. This is the data. So you have words like to obtain and to put away, which was spelled with the and the word for in and to put. They originally had different vowels, different rhymes, but in the inscriptions they were basically, they can be spelled with either symbol. So this means that in the inscription, the two sounds had merged. So early Old Thai I and al had merged in the later Old Thai. So we can see phonological innovations in the Old Thai language. So the inscriptions actually reflect an older stage of Old Thai, a later stage of Old Thai, a stage which comes relatively, a stage which is more recent than the stage when the Khmer script was first adapted to write Thai. So what this suggests is that the old Tai system, as reflected by the oldest Tai inscription, displays graphic variations that points to phonological innovations within Old Tai. This discrepancies between the original system and this innovative system reflected in the inscriptions strongly suggest that the Tai language must have been written prior to the 14th century. So that means that the Tai language may have arrived in central Thailand at least in the 13th century. We can't say much more about this because that's all the data permit us to say. But personally, I don't think it was there in the 12th century because the first mention of a Siam was in the Pagan inscription in the 12th century. So I guess it shouldn't, the Tai language shouldn't go away that far, but we can discuss about this later. So that's what but then we can ask the second question about the nature of the establishment of the Tai language in central Thailand, how the Tai language arrived in central Thailand. One scenario was through cultural diffusion, which is the spread of language without migration. So you have a dominance of a new language in a population originally speaking a different language. So the indigenous people would have shifted from whatever language they were speaking to the incoming language, in this case, the Tai language. So if it's a case of cultural diffusion, you wouldn't see a lot of genetic exchange between the speakers. So because nobody really come down, nobody really moved in. So the people stay where they are, but they just decided to speak a new language. This is in contrast with the Demic diffusion scenario, where you have a real migration of population into a new territory. And this could be prompted by this could be due to population growth prompted by new resources or technological development. So people had to move out to new territories because overpopulation in the original homeland. This dispersal into a new region, this would mean dispersal into a new region with low population density, and you would see limited initial genetic admixture between the arrival group and the indigenous group. And the third model is the continuous migration model, which is a mix of the two models. So you could have an initial migration of a new population into a new territory. But when they come into the new territory, they came into contact with the indigenous people, and they started mixing. So the language of the newcomer may have supplanted the language of the indigenous people. But when you look at the genetics of the speakers, you can see that the speakers have ancestry from both the newcomers and the indigenous people, which can be schematized here. So the Demic diffusion would mean that the Tai speakers is genetically closer to Tai speakers in southern China. But the cultural diffusion model would mean that the central Tai speaker, even though they speak a Tai language, they are genetically closer to Mon-Khmer speakers. which is the indigenous people of Thailand. But the continuous migration would mean that the speakers of Central Thai is genetically closest to other Thai languages, but there's a lot of genetic mixture from Mon-Khmer speakers. But how do we study this kind of prehistory without any record that tells us what happens during that time, during the 13th century? I'm approaching this by I'm approaching this from the perspective of language contact, which is a phenomenon whereby two languages, speakers of two languages encounter each other and they influence each other. So when two languages come into contact, two things could happen. First, one language can borrow features from another language. So then the community, the speakers maintain their original language, but they borrow stuff from the language they're in contact with. So what can they borrow? They can borrow cultural vocabulary, high register words, like learned words, or they can borrow structural features like sounds and grammatical features, but it has to be in a very close and intense contact. So if people maintain their own language, they only borrow structure. They first borrow vocabulary, cultural vocabulary. When the contact becomes more intense, they start borrowing phonological and grammatical features. This would be consistent with the Demic diffusion scenario. But you can have a different scenario of language contact whereby a community of speakers lose their language. They shift to a new language, but they still keep features from their old language because they couldn't get rid of it. Just like, when immigrants move into, also, let's say if you are colonized by people from somewhere else and you have to start speaking their language, you would first learn their vocabulary, but you would still retain a lot of your grammatical features. You still have an accent to speak, so to speak. So when you have two languages in contact and the community, the indigenous community, lose their language but don't have perfect command of the new language, they would shows a lot of phonological and grammatical features from their old language in their new language. So in our case here, if Mon-Khmer speakers shifted to Thai, they would speak Thai with a Mon-Khmer accent, an Austroasiatic accent. So they would speak Thai with all the lexical, all the words from Thai, but with strong Mon-Khmer accent. And this would be consistent with the cultural diffusion model of population movement. Okay, so do we have linguistic evidence for the type of language contact that was happening in the 14th century? If you look at Khmer loanwords in Old Thai, you can see that most of you don't see a lot of general words that you would use in everyday life. in the inscription that are from Khmer. So you see words like lu, to reach, which is Khmer, which was borrowed from Khmer, but there are very few of them. Most of the Khmer words that you find in the Thai inscriptions were learned or specialized vocabulary related to kingship or religion, like one Pradisthatan, occasion, establish, or royal authority. These are Khmer loanwords or Indic words borrowed via Khmer, and they're all kind of learned vocabulary. So it's not something you would say in everyday life. You also see Khmer loanwords in expression, like you have this compound of chloi, chloi, koi, ka, you compound captive, chloi, which is a Khmer word, and koi and ka, which are Thai words. So you actually combine Thai and Khmer words together. This kind of suggests that that both Thai and Khmer were being spoken back then. And another category of Khmer loanwords in Old Thai is feudal titles and place names. These were in Indic loanword or Indic words borrowed from Khmer or original Khmer vocabulary. So now we see general words in Thai and specialized word in Khmer, suggesting that it's actually not a case of language shift, but it's Thai speakers, the Thai language borrowing words that they didn't have from Khmer, or borrowing words from Khmer for cultural reasons. We also have phonological evidence for the speakers of Thai for borrowing phonological for borrowing of phonological features. So even though Diller speculates that the Old Thai merged the k and the kh sound because of Mon-Khmer substratum, which means that Mon-Khmer speakers couldn't make the contrast between the two sounds. But this is a speculation, because the merger between k and kh could have happened by itself, not because of interference from the Khmer language. But what we see here, but on the other hand, Khmer and Mon both have had, since back then until now, two sounds, the y and the ny sound. They still retain it even today. But what you see in the old inscription is that the y and the ny sound were becoming one sound. They were merging. So they were basically Old Thai lost the ny sound. If it was Mon-Khmer speakers shifting to Thai, they shouldn't have lost the contrast, because in their language they had the contrast. So the fact that they actually lost the contrast means that it wasn't Mon-Khmer speakers shifting to Thai, but it was Thai speakers borrowing features from Mon-Khmer. We also see evidence for loanword adaptation. Loanword adaptation happens when you say a word from a language that you don't speak very well. So when you speak, like English speakers may pronounce French words with an English accent, you have to adapt the French word into your system. And you do that because you don't master the language. Okay, so we see evidence for loanword adaptation in the old Thai inscription. So when Khmer words were borrowed into Thai, the Thai speakers had to adapt it to, because they couldn't pronounce it the way the Khmer speakers pronounced it. For example, Khmer final S were being written in Thai sometimes with an S, sometimes with a T, with a final T. So this means that for the Thai speakers, words with final S and words with final T were pronounced the same. So we see an adaptation from Khmer into Thai, suggesting that the Thai speakers weren't very proficient in Khmer. So the word for to reach from Ross in Old Khmer, it was pronounced as rot in Old Thai. The word for rake, grass, were pronounced as grat in Old Thai. Similarly, final R's were confused with final N because the Old Thai didn't have final R's. So the name for the year of the pig, Gur, were written as Gun in the Old Thai inscription. The words for to walk, Der in Old Khmer, was written with an N, final N in Old Thai inscription. So this means that the writer, the scribes, didn't know that these Khmer words were supposed to have final R's. This is also true with final L's. So Tnol were written with final N in old inscriptions, and Gangwol was written with final N in the old Thai inscription. So these kind of loanword adaptations suggest that the speakers of old Thai didn't really have a Khmer accent. If they had a Khmer accent, they would have known, they would have been able to pronounce these sounds, but they couldn't. Okay. The next question I want to look at is, so we know from the inscriptions that it's a case of Thai speakers borrowing things from the Khmer language rather than Mon-Khmer speakers shifting to the Thai language. But how intense was the contact between Thai speakers and Mon-Khmer speakers? This table shows degrees of contact, degrees of different intensity of contact. So if speakers of two languages are in casual contact, they only borrow words for cultural and functional reasons, things that they didn't have, or names for concepts that they didn't have, or words to make them sound smart or something like that. But when you but if you are in more intimate, more intense contact, you would start borrowing things like conjunctions and adverbial particles. The next step is to borrow adpositions, personal and demonstrative pronouns, lower numerals, derivational affixes, etc. We don't see any of that in Old Thai. The only thing that we see in the lexicon was borrowed words that we saw earlier. So we only borrowed cultural vocabulary. So this suggests casual contact between the two groups. But if we look at the phonological features, the structure, we can see that Old Thai took some of the features from Old Khmer into their own language. So this is the inventory of vowels in Old Thai. The ones that are in blue are the new ones. The ones that are in black are the ones that have been there forever. But the blue ones are ones that they borrowed from Khmer. And the older stage of Thai didn't have these vowels. These are the long A, long O, and vowels. But these words were borrowed. They were borrowed through loan words. They didn't just borrow. They didn't just borrow the sounds. They borrowed the words, and the sounds came with the words. For example, there was sopa, which is actually an Indic loan word that were borrowed from Mon-Khmer, from Khmer. But there are also like native Khmer words like broad and like broad. So these words had long O in Khmer. So when we borrowed these words, we borrowed the long O. So the highlight was in the different place. Yeah. So we borrowed the long O when we borrowed the words. We didn't just borrow the sounds. We borrowed the word and the sound just came with them. This is the same for the A. You have things like Devi, Dev, JD, and Dej. These are Indic loan words that we borrowed through Khmer. If you are curious why this is the case, we can talk about that later in the Q&A question. Old Thai also had clusters that didn't exist before, but they got it from Khmer, like clusters like tr, tr, kr, tl, tr, kl, and kr. And again, these new clusters come with the loan words, come with the words that Old Thai borrowed from Old Khmer. So words like prod, prachu, plat, prabat. Another feature that Old Thai got from Old Khmer was multisyllabicity. So originally, Thai languages were monosyllabic languages, but modern Thai has lots of words that are longer than one syllable. And this is also the case in Old Thai. Almost all multi-syllable words in Old Thai were borrowed words, especially from Khmer. For example, the word Paya, Chalak, Panuat, Samnak. These are disyllables. You also have multi-syllable words, which are Indic words borrowed via Khmer. Pratana, Nirapan, Raja Sombat. And the only case of disyllables, the only case of disyllabic word that I found in this inscription that came from original Thai words were the word for sun, which was written as Tawan. But this is an invention, an innovation. So it came from Ta, which means I, and One, which means they. So we actually get some kind of reduction, but that's the only case we found. What this tells us is that the intensity of contact was not very high. So you borrow new phonemes, but you borrow new sounds, but these new sounds are only confined in loan words because you borrow these sounds with the words. You don't see things like borrowing sound directly or developing your own structure on the model of the prestige language without borrowing on not and apply it to your vocabulary from your own language. What we see in the old Thai inscription is whatever phonological features we found to be borrowed from Old Khmer was through loan word. It was limited only in loan words. So this means that the contact wasn't that intense in the 13th, 14th century. The result of the linguistic analysis seems to be consistent with genetic evidence. And this is based on studies by geneticists that I've worked with. So they look at mitochondrial DNA, which represents maternal descent, because mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to daughter, and it's pretty stable across time. So what they find is that most of the Central Thai populations share haplotypes with other Thai-speaking groups, including Northeastern Thai and Northern Thai speakers. When they test the different models of population growth, they found that Demic diffusion is the most likely scenario, but only slightly more likely than the continuous migration model. So they think that Demic diffusion with possibly with a very low genetic gene flow from Austroasiatic groups is the most likely scenario for the origins of Kra-Dai populations in central Thailand. So very little genetic exchange between the indigenous people and the incoming Thai speakers. When they compare mitochondrial DNA from modern populations with the DNA of ancient human remains that we found in Nakhon Ratchasima, they found that ancient populations are genetically closest to the Nyagur. So the skeletons actually are genetically closer to the Nyagur, who we mentioned earlier are descendants of the Mons that were pushed away by the Khmer and the Thai. So this is very neat, although not surprising. It's really neat. But what we see here is that Thai groups form close affinity among themselves and are relatively distant from the ancient and the Austroasiatic population. So Thai groups cluster together, but are quite distant from Austroasiatic speakers. So, but we do see some genetic links between Thai and Khmer, which is probably due to population admixture. That was results from mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to daughter. Now we are going to look at a more recent analysis of the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son. So it tells you about the paternal history of the population. So what they find is that Central Thai speakers cluster with other Thai speaking groups. Again, you see genetic homogeneity among Thai speaking groups. But you also see closer genetic relationships to local Austroasiatic populations, which lend weak support to the cultural diffusion model. What's very curious is that the result from the Y chromosome is different from the result from the maternal, from the mitochondrial DNA, which suggests that the paternal descent and the maternal descent had different history for the Thai population, for the central Thai population. So if we try to correlate linguistics and genetic evidence, this is the scenario I would like to propose. So Southwestern Tai speakers came down from the north and resettled in central Thailand as communities, bringing with them their language, the Thai language. But there was really no abrupt and large-scale language shift on the part of the indigenous Austroasiatic speaking population. So the Thai bring in a new language, and the Austroasiatic population maintained their language. They didn't shift en masse to speaking Thai. But since they were in contact because of co-territoriality or because Khmer culture was perceived as higher, the Thai language borrowed moderately from the Khmer language. So that's why you see what borrowing of words in Old Thai. But as the Thai speaking population grew, intermarriages and smaller scale language shifts of the indigenous population to Thai became more common. So slowly the indigenous population started to assimilate to Thai. So they started to speak Thai instead. But the different paternal and maternal genetic history of the Thai speakers is very intriguing. It's not clear why that is the case. I think possibly because Thai speakers are typically matrilocal. Greater genetic contribution from Austroasiatic speakers are found on the paternal side. So when Austroasiatic Austroasiatic speaking men married a Thai speaking woman, they move into the community, so they pass on their genetic to the offsprings. Okay, so that's why you see a lot of Austroasiatic speakers, Austroasiatic contribution on the paternal side. And so to conclude, this is my conclusion. Graphic variation in the Sukhothai and Ayutthaya inscription suggests that the Thai language had arrived in central Thailand before the 14th century, perhaps in the 13th century. Middle Thai, Old Thai uses Khmer vocabulary in high register and show non-Austroasiatic phonological traits, indicating borrowing rather than substrate interference from Khmer. The intensity of the Thai-Khmer contact was moderate, as phonological characteristics that Old Thai borrowed from Mon-Khmer were only limited in loan words. The genetic result seems to be consistent with the linguistic scenario I just proposed. Genetic structure of Thai-speaking populations points to migration from southern China, possibly with a considerable level of genetic admixture from Austroasiatic speaking groups after their arrival in central Thailand. And that's the end of my presentation. I would love to hear from the audience, and we can discuss this topic or other topics relating to the history and prehistory of Thai language. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Let us wait for you to stop sharing your screen. Thank you. This was absolutely amazing presentation. I've learned so many new things, and I never knew that it's possible to track through linguistics so many different aspects of migration and cultural adaptations. We do have one question in the pipeline from the person who sent it privately to us in the chat. So you cannot see it in the chat yet. And the person is based in Asia, so she couldn't actually stay with us until now, but she asked us to pass this question to you. So let me read it out, and then the rest of the questions you will be able to see in the chat. So the question goes, well, it starts with thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk, which was very rich and interesting. My question is, if you covered the area, did the Tai language spoken by the Siamese communities in northern Malaysia go through the same evolution? What explains the different variations of Tai spoken in west, similar to southern Tai, and east, similar to Chenya, northern Malaysia, despite the two regions being so near to each other? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, my answer to the first question is, I don't know. That's really, so this is frustrating because not many people work on Southern Tai. It's a very underexplored area. You don't, in our genetic studies, I think we didn't include populations. We didn't get samples from Southern Thailand at all. So we don't know what the genetic history is. Linguistically, it's really not clear what happens, but there are studies that shows that there are a lot of Khmer words, even more than Central Thai. There are more Khmer words in Southern Thai, in the Southern dialect than in the Central Thai dialects. And that's very curious how that happened. Yep, so my answer is, I don't know. I guess in the case of there's another complication, which is we didn't know what language was spoken in Southern Thailand back then, whether it was an Austroasiatic speaking community, whether Austroasiatic languages had supplanted the original Mon-Khmer languages. By then, we really don't know. So yeah, so it really needs further study. But what we know for sure is that each region seems to have different history. So when you look at the genetic study, the same genetic study that I showed you, the result is that in the north, in northern Thailand, you don't see much of Austroasiatic contribution in their genetic at all. It seems like there weren't that much intermarriages in the north, but in the central part, you see a lot of contribution, genetic contribution from Austroasiatic speaking groups. So in the south, it must have been different, I think, and I think it's more complex too. But as for the two dialect groups in the east and in the west, the thing is, the difference between the two dialect groups are exaggerated. They're not that different, but there are some features that are different, and people latched on. They differ in terms of tones, but and some vocabulary. But I think they can be thought of as more innovative and more conservative dialects of the same language, basically. But I don't know, this is another issue that we can debate about. But this has to do with the geography of southern Thailand. You have a mountain range that runs from north to south, and that kind of divides central Thailand into the eastern coast and the western coast. And you see the effect of the mountain range that so you see different dialects on the different sides of the mountains. That's a very curious pattern. I hope I answered the questions.
I am sure you did. It was a very, very thorough answer. We have one more question, and I think I may call this a last question because I understand you said you had to leave at 9:30, or there's another question. We may have, do you want to answer those last two questions, or you just want to leave it for John Whitman's question and call it a day? It's up to you.
Oh, I can still a little bit, I can stay a little bit longer. I just need to go before 10.
Okay, so I think I'll just call this for, since you do have a talk and you would like to prepare for it, just call these as the last two questions. And so I'm gonna go for John Whitman's question. Would you like to say your question or live, or would you like me to say it for you? Okay, I can just do it. So as you noted, preponderance genetic markers for the paternal line from the I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry, Atochonas
population is unusual in cases of Demic diffusion. You attribute this to time metric locality, but is this enough? To me, it suggests settlement without military conquest, at least at the initial stages, and a protracted period of Thai settlement without political dominance. Yeah, I totally agree that metric locality is not enough. In fact, I really don't know how to explain it. Metric locality may just be one of the factors. One factor that the geneticist came up with had to do with warfare, actually, because so what they say is not in the 14th century, but later in the history of Thai, warfares between the kingdoms meant that people were taken captives after, if they lose. So, and they said that affected the captives were mostly men. So the women weren't typically taken captive. So that meant more mixed up in the male line. I'm not sure if that would be the case, because usually in Southeast Asian warfare, whole communities were moved, not just the male. So I don't know. And what we have to be careful about is that the genetic the genetic situation that we see nowadays may not actually reflect the history. So reflect the population of the 14th century, because between the 14th century and now, there were so much population movement. And for example, there were Mon speakers moving in from Myanmar because they, for political reasons and stuff. So that might have affect the genetic makeup of the Central Thai speakers. So yeah, thank you. That I think that those two factors are highly possible.
Thank you, Joe. And we did have one more question. I see we have more questions coming in. We see the comment from Nelson, but I think we would just need to be considerate that Joe has another commitment. He's actually given another talk at 10 a.m. Bangkok time. So we would need to pick one last question from Tanta. And after that, we would need to excuse Joe to move to his other commitments. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, Nelson. So the question from Tanta from University of Ottawa is, I was wondering if there is any interaction, either direction, between Tai and Mon-Khmer languages in terms of their prosodic system, tone register, that you could get from investigating inscriptions.
Well, this is a great question. So that's really is an area that still needs a lot of research, but what I can, in terms of tone, what I can say is that there's this very curious phenomenon. So Thai languages used to have 3 tones, and then the 3 tones split into 6 tones, and that happened when two sets of consonants merged with each other. So what used to be voiced consonant the, t, b became p, t, k in Thai. So we call this register split, and we see the exact same split in Khmer. So so you have the same vowels, the same written vowels are pronounced 2 different ways depending on the onset, right? So you see the same kind of register split. And I think Sirimat's a graduate student in the Department of Linguistics at Cornell is working on this question, but basically the same kind of things. So split of tone from 3 to 6, and the split of vowels from 1 set of vowels to 2 sets of vowels in Mon-Khmer. I think it happened at about the same time. So I'm not sure whether it's so common in Southeast Asia that it's hard to tell whether it was due to contact between the two or for some other reasons. But the fact that it was happening at the same time suggests that they might have something to do with each other. And the direction of the influence is not clear either, because by the mid 14th century, the direction of influence had reversed. The Thai Ayutthaya had risen, and Thai was actually influenced. Thai was actually politically and politically more dominant than Cambodia back then. So the Thai had reversed. So yeah, so I don't know if I answer your question, but I hope Sirimat's dissertation will shed lights on that. I think I can take Nielsen's problem, Nielsen's question. I'm not actually giving a talk at 10. I'm hosting a talk at 10, so I don't need a lot of time to moderate that. So I'll take Nielsen's question as the last question. Why is it that some populations of Khmer were displaced by Thai speakers, and some maintain their language and culture? For example, Northern Khmer. Northern Khmer here means Surin, right? People in Surin. Well, you can see that, so it has to do with, one factor is geography. So people on the fringe are less affected by cultural changes in the center. So like when we see Nyaku speaker who still maintains their Monic language, they're all on the fringe. So what's happened in the center doesn't doesn't get carried to the margin of the political territory. But what we have to, but in the case of Northern Khmer, though, it's not the case that they maintain their language even though they're in Surin. They actually moved. They more recently migrated from Cambodia, probably in the Ayutthaya period, later Ayutthaya period. Before that, we believe that the speakers of that area spoke other Mon-Khmer languages like Katu, Kui, or Kue, but then Northern Khmer speakers came from Cambodia proper and replaced them. I think that's what happened. So.
All right, and with that being the last question, thank you so much, Joe, for joining us and talking to us about your linguistics lecture. And thank you everyone for staying and asking your wonderful questions. We hope to see you next week. We have another lecture about textiles in Indonesia and Malaysia, and it'll be joined by Tribu Quizon. So enjoy the rest of your nights or your mornings or your afternoons or your very late nights, as some people have called, from 3 a.m. as they have messaged me. So enjoy the rest of your day, night, and whatever time zone you may be on.
Thank you, the SIP Graduate Student Committee for giving me the opportunity to talk here, and thank you everyone for attending the talk. Thank you.